Stepmom left her kids at my house while I was at work and went with Dad on their honeymoon without... My name is Tiffany. I'm 23 years old, and until recently, I would have described my life as simple, predictable, and, for the most part, peaceful. I live in the house I inherited from my grandmother, my mom's mom. And that house has been my safe haven ever since my mother passed away from an aggressive form of cancer a few years ago. Losing her was devastating. She was the glue that held everything together. After her death, it was just me and my dad. Dad lives on the other side of the city, and despite the endless battle with horrific traffic and the exhausting commute, I made it a personal tradition to visit him every Friday after work. It became our ritual, a way to end the week and carve out something comforting amidst the chaos. I would pick up his favorite Chinese takeout, the kind he loved but never admitted was far too greasy, and we'd spend the evening in his small living room. We'd watch old movies, mostly ones that Mom had loved, sharing memories of her as the hours passed. Those evenings were sacred to me, an anchor that kept me connected not just to Dad, but also to the memory of Mom. But everything changed on one of those Friday visits, shattering the little world we had built together. That night, I arrived at Dad's place as usual, balancing 2 large bags of takeout and expecting the familiar comfort of our routine. Instead, I walked into something entirely unexpected. The first thing I noticed was Dad pacing the living room, his face a mixture of nervous excitement. The second thing? He wasn't alone. "Tiffany, honey, there's someone I want you to meet," he said, his voice tinged with both anticipation and hesitation. He gestured toward the couch where a woman sat. She was striking, early 30s, I guessed, with impeccably styled hair, a polished outfit that screamed confidence, and a smile that seemed a little too perfect. "This is Rachel," Dad continued, his hands fidgeting awkwardly. She's my fiancée." For a moment, I was frozen. The word fiancé hung in the air like an unwelcome guest. Fiancé? My dad had never even mentioned dating, let alone being serious enough to propose marriage. My hands tightened around the takeout bags as I felt a surge of emotions, confusion, anger, and maybe even betrayal. How could he move on from Mom like this? Did she mean so little to him that he could just replace her? But just as quickly as the anger came, I caught myself. It had been several years since Mom passed. Was I being selfish? Dad deserved to be happy too, didn't he? Rachel stood up and extended her hand toward me, her practiced smile unwavering. "I've heard so much about you, Tiffany," she said warmly. "Your father talks about you all the time." Her voice was smooth, almost too smooth, like she was trying a little too hard to win me over. I forced myself to smile, although it probably looked more like a grimace, and shook her hand. "Nice to meet you," I managed to say, even though my thoughts were anything but nice. My mind raced with questions. Who was this woman? How long had they been together? And why was I just finding out about her now? The evening that followed was awkward, to say the least. We sat down to eat, and while Rachel chatted enthusiastically about herself, her job, and how she and Dad met, I tried to process the fact that my dad had an entirely new life I knew nothing about. To his credit, Dad looked happier than I had seen him in years. He kept glancing at Rachel with an expression I could only describe as pure adoration, and she responded with affectionate touches on his arm or shoulder that seemed both natural and calculated. Just as I was starting to accept that maybe the situation wasn't as bad as I'd thought, Rachel dropped another bombshell. It happened casually, almost offhand, like she was commenting on the weather.
"Oh, by the way,"
she said as she helped Dad clear the plates.
"my boys are so excited to meet you."
I blinked, unsure if I had heard her correctly. "Boys?" She smiled, oblivious to my growing discomfort. "Yes, Tommy and Jake. They're 6 and 8, such wonderful ages, aren't they?" I nearly choked on my water. Children? She had children? How had Dad failed to mention that tiny detail? And why did Rachel act like it was no big deal to spring this on me? Something about her delivery bothered me, but I pushed the feeling aside. This was a lot to process in one evening. "That's great," I said, my voice strained but polite. "I look forward to meeting them." The drive home that night was a blur. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. In the span of a few hours, my quiet, predictable life had been upended. My dad had a fiancée, she had kids, and I was now expected to somehow fit into this new family dynamic. Things moved quickly after that night. Rachel and her sons, Tommy and Jake, moved into Dad's house within weeks. The boys were energetic and noisy, as you'd expect for their ages, running through the house, leaving a trail of toys and chaos in their wake. Tommy was obsessed with video games, and Jake, the younger one, seemed physically incapable of sitting still for more than 5 minutes. They were exhausting, but they had their sweet moments too, like when Jake proudly showed me his latest crayon masterpiece, or when Tommy shyly asked for my help with a difficult level in his game. Before I knew it, wedding plans were in full swing, and Rachel threw herself into the preparations with the enthusiasm of someone planning the Oscars. Every detail had to be perfect, from the flower arrangements to the shade of the tablecloths. And of course, I was dragged into the chaos. "Tiffany, sweetie," Rachel would say, her voice sugary enough to give me a cavity. "Would you mind watching the boys for a couple of hours? I have an emergency meeting with the florist." Or, "The cake tasting got rescheduled last minute. Could you keep an eye on Tommy and Jake?" At first, I didn't mind. It was only for a few hours here and there, and I wanted to show Dad that I was trying to make this work. But as the wedding drew closer, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life was slipping out of my control, and I wasn't sure how much more of Rachel's emergencies I could handle. Then came the wedding day, a day that was supposed to symbolize new beginnings and family unity. The ceremony itself went off without a hitch. The boys, surprisingly clean and dressed to the nines in their little suits, managed to sit still and behave like angels, at least at the start. I let myself relax, thinking perhaps this would be a rare, drama-free family event. But I should have known better. By the time the reception dragged into the dinner hour, the boys started to get antsy. I noticed Tommy, the older of the two, fiddling with his spoon in that mischievous way that only a child with too much energy and too little supervision could. My instincts kicked in when I saw him scoop up a spoonful of peas and launch it directly at his brother. Of course, JK wasn't one to back down from a challenge. Before I could even make it to their table, he was locked and loaded with mashed potatoes, firing back with reckless glee. I walked over briskly, trying to remain calm despite the ridiculousness of the scene. "Hey guys," I said firmly, my tone leaving no room for argument. "That's enough. You're going to hit someone if you keep that up." But my attempt at diffusing the situation was short-lived. JK smirked as if testing just how far he could push, while Tommy ignored me entirely, preparing for another attack. Before I could intervene, Rachel appeared out of nowhere, her presence as sudden and jarring as a thunderstorm on a sunny day. Her hand clamped down on my arm with surprising force, and before I could say a word, she dragged me behind one of the decorative pillars. Her expression was venomous, a stark contrast to the polished, smiling demeanor she'd maintained in front of others. "Don't you ever speak to my children like that again," she hissed, her words cutting through the air like a whip. I blinked, caught off guard. "They were throwing food at other guests," I tried to explain, still rubbing my arm where her manicured nails had left their mark. I was just trying to stop them before it became a bigger issue. Rachel wasn't having it. She cut me off, her voice a low, menacing growl. "Listen to me very carefully," she began, leaning in as if delivering a threat. "These are my children. You have absolutely no right to discipline them. None. When you have your own kids, if you ever have your own kids, you can play mommy all you want. But until then, stay in your lane and keep your mouth shut." Before I could respond, she plastered that trademark fake smile back onto her face and floated back to the reception like nothing had happened, cozying up to my dad and dazzling the guests with her charm. I stood there, stunned, my mind racing as I tried to process what had just unfolded. That moment was a turning point, though I didn't fully realize it at the time. It wasn't until a few days later that the changes began. Subtle at first, but undeniable. It was like Rachel had been waiting for that ring on her finger to show her true self. The following Friday, I stuck to my usual tradition of visiting Dad after work. I fought through over an hour of grueling rush hour traffic, eager to unwind with our usual dinner ritual. I even stopped by Tony's, the restaurant my parents used to frequent, to pick up Dad's favorite lasagna, a gesture that had always been warmly received. But when I walked through the front door, something was different. Rachel was sprawled out on the couch, our couch, the one Mom and Dad used to sit on together, scrolling through her phone like she owned the place. The boys were running amok, their laughter echoing through the living room as they chased each other around, nearly knocking over a lamp in the process. Rachel barely glanced up. "Oh, Tiffany," she said, her tone dripping with faux surprise. "You really should call before coming over."
I froze, the takeout bag still in my hand. Call? But Dad and I always spend Friday evenings together. It's our tradition.
Rachel's eyes narrowed as she sat up straighter. "Well, things are different now," she said, her voice laced with condescension. "Your father has a family now, and I'll be the one establishing new traditions around here." Her words hit me like a slap. Family? As if I didn't count anymore? My gaze shifted to Dad, who was sitting in his armchair, his face buried in his tablet like it held the secrets of the universe. He didn't even look up, didn't say a word. The man who had always been my rock, who had taught me to stand up for myself, just sat there in silence. Before I could process the sting of betrayal, Rachel's expression shifted to one of sudden delight. "But since you're here," she said, springing to her feet and grabbing her purse, "and you brought dinner, this is perfect. Your father and I have been wanting to try that new Italian place downtown. We'll have a proper date night, and you can watch the boys." It happened so fast, I barely had time to react. One moment, I was standing there with a bag of lasagna. The next, Rachel was dragging Dad out of his chair, chattering about what she should wear. 10 minutes later, they were gone. No asking if I was free, no checking if I had plans. Just gone. The lasagna I'd brought for Dad and me ended up on plates in front of Tommy and JK, who bickered over the portion sizes like it was some grand competition. The next 3 hours were a blur of breaking up fights, preventing furniture from becoming jungle gyms, and trying to keep the house from descending into chaos. By the time Dad and Rachel strolled back in around 11 p.m., I was running on fumes. "Oh, we had such a wonderful evening," Rachel gushed, her eyes lighting up as she recounted their night. She didn't even glance at the mess her kids had made or offer a word of thanks. Instead, she herded the boys upstairs with a chirpy, "Time for bed," leaving me to clean up the aftermath. As she turned back to me, stifling an obviously fake yawn, she added, "Well, it's getting quite late, isn't it?" And with that, she disappeared upstairs, leaving me standing there in the wreckage, wondering when my own home had become a stranger's playground. "You should probably head home, Tiffany. You have quite a drive ahead of you." Those words played on repeat in my mind as I gripped the steering wheel that evening, trying to shake off the frustration bubbling in my chest. I had barely managed to scrape together enough energy to finish my day at work, and now Rachel's antics had become the unwelcome soundtrack to my life. By the following week, things had escalated to an entirely new level of absurdity. Rachel, who didn't work and spent her days managing the household, her words not mine, had started showing up at my house unannounced. She always had some flimsy excuse ready, her boys in tow and her plans conveniently incompatible with having them around. "I have an emergency mani-pedi appointment," she'd chirp, already backing toward her car as though the thought of asking for my help was too burdensome. Or, "Your father is taking me to that new French bistro. The boys hate French food. We'll pick them up in a few hours." She didn't even bother pretending to ask anymore. She just dropped them off, waved vaguely, and drove away like I was some kind of on-call babysitting service. No warning, no courtesy text, no nothing. Sometimes she'd show up just as I was pulling into the driveway after work, my blouse wrinkled, heels pinching my feet, and my brain too fried to argue. She knew I was too exhausted to fight her on it, and honestly, I think she reveled in it. This pattern dragged on for weeks, each visit a little more brazen than the last, until I finally reached my breaking point. It was a Wednesday evening, and I had just slogged through one of the most grueling days at work I'd had in months. 3 back-to-back client presentations had drained me, and a system crash had erased hours of progress on a major project. All I wanted was to take a long, scalding shower, put on my coziest pajamas, and collapse on my couch with takeout. Instead, as I pulled into my driveway, I spotted Rachel's oversized SUV parked obnoxiously in the middle, as if to claim the space as her own. She was already unloading the boys and their backpacks, a bright, infuriating smile plastered on her face.
Perfect timing, she trilled, practically shoving Tommy toward my front door. I've got a spa appointment and then dinner with your father. They'll need dinner in about an hour.
I stood there, stunned for a moment before the anger that had been simmering for weeks finally boiled over. No, I said firmly, the word surprising even me with its sharpness. I wasn't hired to be your personal babysitter. I'm tired, I've had a long day, and I didn't agree to this. Her face twisted into a deep shade of crimson, her previously cheery demeanor evaporating. How dare you? She spat, yanking the boys back toward her car with such force that Tommy nearly tripped. Boys, get in the car, she snapped, her voice like a whip. She turned back to me, her eyes blazing. You'll regret this attitude, Tiffany, she hissed before storming off. Her tires squealed as she sped out of my driveway, leaving a pair of angry black marks on the pavement. I went inside, my heart still pounding from the confrontation, and made myself a cup of tea, hoping the warmth would soothe the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I had just started to relax on the couch when my phone rang. The screen lit up with a name that sent my stomach sinking. Dad. What the hell is wrong with you? He barked the moment I picked up, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. How dare you speak to my wife that way? She's in tears. Dad, wait.
No, you wait, he thundered, cutting me off. You're being cruel and selfish. I won't tolerate you treating my wife like this. She's been nothing but kind to you.
Dad, please, just listen. But he had already hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand, my chest tight and my mind reeling. My father had never spoken to me like that before, not once in my entire life. I felt gutted, like someone had reached inside me and pulled something vital away. A week passed in silence. No calls, no texts, no unexpected visits. Part of me was relieved to finally have some peace and quiet, but another part felt hollow, bruised by the rift that had suddenly formed between me and my father. By Friday, I decided to treat myself to a quiet evening in. I picked up takeout and a bottle of wine, eager to finally unwind after the chaos of the past few weeks. But as I approached my house, I froze. Laughter, childish, high-pitched, unmistakable, was coming from inside. My heart leapt into my throat. Was someone inside my house? I fumbled for my phone, ready to call the police, when the sound of the TV blaring cartoons reached my ears. I unlocked the door with shaking hands and stepped inside to find chaos. Tommy and Jake were sprawled out on my living room floor, surrounded by a sea of empty snack wrappers and half-drunk juice boxes. The coffee table was littered with crumbs, and the boys were completely oblivious to my arrival. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. Tommy shrugged, his eyes glued to the screen. "Mom dropped us off like 4 hours ago," he said casually. "She used the key to let us in and said we could eat whatever we wanted and watch TV." The key. The spare I'd given my father when I first moved in, for emergencies only. "When is she coming back?" I asked, dreading the answer. Jake grinned up at me, entirely unbothered. "She's not. She and your dad left for their honeymoon in Hawaii. They'll be gone for 2 weeks. I stared at them, my mind racing. 2 weeks. She had left her children in my house, alone, for 4 hours with no warning, and expected me to care for them for the next 2 weeks. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone. Before dialing Rachel's number, I opened my recording app and hit start. Something told me I needed to document this conversation. The phone rang, and rang, and rang. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to keep calm even though my hands were already trembling with frustration. "What do I want?" I repeated, struggling to steady my voice. "How about you explain why you broke into my house and dumped your kids here without even bothering to ask me first?" Rachel's laugh was shrill and dismissive, the kind that made your skin crawl. "Oh, please, Tiffany, don't be so dramatic. I used a key, so it's hardly breaking in. And let's be real, you don't exactly have a packed schedule. It's not like you have anything better to do."
"Excuse me?"
I shot back, incredulous.
Let's be honest, Tiffany, she said, her tone oozing with condescension. You're just sitting at home alone anyway. No boyfriend, no social life, no family of your own. Think of this as practice for when, if, you ever manage to find someone willing to start a family with you.
Before I could muster a response, she hung up. The sharp click of the line going dead felt like a slap in the face. My pulse raced, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Without thinking, I immediately dialed my dad, my fingers trembling as I hit the call button. He picked up after the second ring, his voice tinged with irritation, as if I were disrupting his grand plans.
What is it, Tiffany? He asked tersely. We're in the middle of starting our honeymoon. Dad, I began, trying to keep my voice from shaking. Rachel left her kids alone in my house. She broke in while I was at work. Stop, he interrupted. His voice clipped. Stop making mountains out of molehills. You're always trying to stir up drama. Can't you just let us enjoy our honeymoon in peace? My grip tightened around the phone. Dad, I work all day, I nearly shouted. I can't watch her kids. I have a job, responsibilities, meetings, deadlines. Then hire a babysitter, he said, as though the solution were painfully obvious. It's not that complicated. I let out a frustrated breath, trying to hold on to whatever shred of composure I had left. If it's so simple, why didn't you or Rachel hire a babysitter before jetting off to Hawaii? We got a last-minute deal on the tickets, he said dismissively, as though that somehow justified everything. There wasn't time to make arrangements. Look, I have to go. Rachel's waiting. And with that, he hung up. I stood there staring at the screen of my phone, struggling to process what had just happened. This was the same man who had once grounded me for a week because I'd forgotten to call when I was going to be 10 minutes late coming home from school. Yet now, he thought it was perfectly fine to abandon 2 young children in someone else's house without any kind of warning or plan. As my thoughts raced, I noticed Tommy sprawled on my couch, completely engrossed in a game on his smartphone. An idea suddenly formed in my mind. Hey, Tommy, I called out, doing my best to keep my voice casual. Do you have your dad's phone number? Your real dad, I mean. Without even glancing up, Tommy nodded. Yeah, we talk to him all the time. Want me to show you? He pulled up his contacts and held out the screen. My heart pounded as I quickly copied the number into my phone. Excusing myself, I stepped into my home office, closing the door behind me for privacy. My hands shook as I dialed the number. The phone rang twice before a deep, steady voice answered. Hello? Hi, I began, my voice trembling slightly. Is this Mr. Anderson? Yes, he replied cautiously. Who's calling? I took a deep breath. You don't know me, but I'm Tiffany, Rachel's new stepdaughter. I'm calling because, well, there's a situation with Tommy and Jake that you should know about. His tone immediately shifted, concern lacing his words. What kind of situation? Are they okay? I told him everything. How Rachel had left the boys at my house without asking, how she'd broken in while I was at work, how she and my father had abandoned them for hours before jetting off to Hawaii without a second thought. As I spoke, I could hear his breathing grow heavier, his silence underscoring the gravity of what I was saying. Text me your address, he said firmly. I'll be there in an hour. And Tiffany, thank you for calling me. Exactly 1 hour later, as promised, my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, I found a tall man in his early 40s standing there, exuding both authority and concern. Beside him was another man in an expensive suit, holding a leather briefcase. Dad! Tommy and Jake shouted in unison, their faces lighting up as they ran to embrace him. He dropped to one knee, wrapping them in a bear hug, the relief on his face palpable. Boys, why don't you go pack up your things, he suggested gently, ruffling their hair, and make sure you clean up any mess you made in Miss Tiffany's house. As the boys scrambled to gather their belongings, he turned to me. This is James Carlton, my attorney, he said, gesturing to the man beside him. Would you mind if we talked for a few minutes? We sat at my kitchen table, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife, while the boys finished tidying up the living room. Mr. Anderson, please call me Steve, ran his hands through his hair, his frustration almost palpable.
It wasn't the kind of frustration that boiled over into anger, but the type that settled into a weary resignation, the kind that comes from years of fighting a losing battle. "I've been dealing with Rachel's stunts for years," he said quietly, his voice low enough to ensure the boys couldn't overhear. "Missing scheduled visits, pulling last-minute changes to the plans, using the kids as leverage against me. Her games never stop. But this," he paused, shaking his head in disbelief, "this is a new low. Beyond anything she's pulled before." He sighed deeply, his jaw tightening. "I pay $4,000 every month in child support. $4,000. And she's spending it on trips to Hawaii while leaving the kids behind like an afterthought, dumping them on strangers, leaving them in an empty house. It's unforgivable." His lawyer, who had been silently listening until now, leaned forward and pulled out a sleek legal pad from his briefcase. He looked at me with a calm, professional demeanor. "Miss Taylor, would you mind recounting exactly what happened? From the beginning, please. Every detail helps." For the next hour, I did just that. I walked them through everything, starting with the wedding, then the gradual escalation of Rachel's unreasonable demands, and finally, today's events. The lawyer took meticulous notes, his pen flying across the page as I spoke. With each detail I shared, his frown grew deeper, his expression hardening with a mix of disbelief and disapproval. "Oh, and there's more," I said, pulling out my phone. "I recorded my conversations with Rachel and my father from earlier today. Would that help?" The lawyer's eyes lit up. "Very helpful," he said with a small nod. "Would you mind forwarding those recordings to me?" I sent him the files without hesitation. The lawyer played them back immediately, and Rachel's condescending tone filled the kitchen, her dismissive remarks like nails on a chalkboard. Steve's jaw clenched tighter with every word. When the recordings finished, the lawyer looked at Steve, a sharp gleam in his eye. "This," he said with quiet conviction, "is exactly what we needed. Abandonment, endangerment, misuse of child support funds. Your ex-wife has handed us a golden opportunity." The next 2 weeks were eerily quiet. Rachel didn't call or text to check on her children. Not even my father bothered to reach out. They were, it seemed, too preoccupied with their tropical paradise to spare a thought for the 2 young boys they had so callously left behind. The house felt peaceful for once, though the silence carried an undercurrent of unease, like the calm before a storm. That storm arrived on a Friday evening. I had just gotten home from work, slipped into a pair of comfortable sweatpants, and was settling in for a quiet night when my front door burst open with a deafening crash. Rachel stormed in like a hurricane, her face flushed an alarming shade of red, with my father trailing behind her, his face a mask of reluctant anger. Rachel clutched an official-looking letter in her perfectly manicured hand, waving it around like a sword. "Tommy! Jake!" she screamed, her voice shrill and panicked as she frantically scanned the room. "Where are my children?" I remained seated on the couch, my calm demeanor a stark contrast to her theatrics. "They're with their father," I said evenly. Rachel froze mid-step, her eyes narrowing in confusion. "What?" "Their father," I repeated. "You know, the man you had children with before marrying my dad, the one who actually cares about their well-being." Her face twisted with fury, and she lunged at me, her nails barely missing my hair. "You little snake," she spat. "Do you know what this is?" She shoved the letter in my face, her hand trembling with rage. "This is a notice from family court. My ex is suing me for full custody. They're threatening to take away my parental rights." I stood, meeting her glare with an unwavering calm. "Maybe you should have thought about that before abandoning your kids in an empty house," I said coldly. "Or using them as pawns in your little games, or spending their child support money on luxury vacations." She spun to face my father, clearly expecting his support. "Do something," she demanded. "This is your daughter we're talking about." But my father didn't rush to her defense. Instead, he stepped forward, his face dark with anger. "I never thought my own daughter could be so vindictive," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "You've destroyed your stepmother's family out of pure spite. As far as I'm concerned, you're no longer my daughter." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I refused to let it show. I straightened my spine and met his gaze. I didn't destroy anything, Dad. Rachel did that all by herself. Rachel let out another shriek of rage and stormed out of the house, my father following close behind without another word. The custody hearing took place 3 weeks later. I sat in the witness box, my hands steady despite Rachel's icy glare burning into me. I recounted everything in excruciating detail: the abandonment, the breaking and entering, the casual disregard for her children's safety. The lawyer played my recorded phone conversation with Rachel, and her face drained of color. Her dismissive laugh echoed through the courtroom like a haunting refrain. Consider this practice for when you finally manage to find someone willing to start a family with you. Her confidence shattered. I watched as the weight of her actions came crashing down around her. The judge's expressions darkened with every new piece of evidence presented. It was as if each word, each photograph, and each testimony added a layer of storm clouds to their demeanor. By the time I finished giving my testimony, Rachel sat slumped in her chair, her earlier smugness replaced with an almost comical look of disbelief. The woman who had walked into the courtroom with her head held high, exuding an air of arrogance, now looked utterly deflated. Her defeat was palpable, and for once, she had nothing to say. When the verdict was delivered, it felt like the final swing of a gavel smashing through all her pretenses. Full custody of the children was awarded to Steve Anderson. Rachel's child support payments were terminated effective immediately. The judge, with a stern and deliberate tone, issued a clear warning. Any further incidents of child endangerment would result in the complete termination of her parental rights. The words echoed in the courtroom, a sharp reminder of how far she had fallen. You would think losing custody of her children would have been a wake-up call for Rachel, a moment of reflection, perhaps even humility. But Rachel was not the kind of person who learned lessons easily. Instead, she and my father embarked on a full-blown campaign of harassment against me. My phone became a battleground, lighting up with messages that spewed every insult imaginable. Each time I blocked their numbers, they found new ones to call from. When those two were blocked, they took things a step further. They began showing up at my house. It started with them pounding on my door at all hours, Rachel's shrill voice piercing through the night like a banshee's wail. Her favorite refrain, "Open this door, you home-wrecking little brat." It was relentless, and for a while, I tried to ignore it. I told myself they would get bored eventually, that their tantrums would burn out like a dying flame. But one day, after a particularly grueling week at work, something inside me snapped. When the banging started again, louder and more insistent than ever, I marched to the door, flung it open, and faced them head-on. My voice was steady, though my patience had long since evaporated. "You want to talk? Fine, let's talk." They stormed into my living room as if they owned the place, Rachel immediately launching into a tirade. Her words were a mix of self-pity and venom. "You've ruined my life," she screeched, her hands flailing dramatically. "I can't even afford my spa treatments anymore without the child support money. How dare you interfere with my family?" I stood there, letting her rant, her words washing over me like static. 30 seconds in, I decided I had heard enough. I turned to my father, cutting Rachel off mid-sentence. "Are you done?" I asked, my voice laced with controlled fury. Rachel, misunderstanding, tried to start up again. "We're not done until—" "I wasn't talking to you," I snapped, holding up a hand to silence her. I shifted my gaze back to my father. "Hey, Dad, remember Mom's house? The one you're living in right now?" He blinked, visibly startled by the sudden change in topic. I didn't wait for him to answer. "You know the house Mom left to me in her will? The one I've been letting you live in, rent-free, out of the goodness of my heart?" The color drained from his face. Rachel's ranting came to an abrupt halt, her mouth hanging open as she stared at me. I straightened up, towering over both of them as I delivered the final blow. "Here's what's going to happen. The harassment stops, the calls stop, the visits stop. Because if they don't, you'll both find yourselves out on the street faster than Rachel here can say, 'Spa day.' And then you can figure out how to survive on your salary alone, with no free housing and no child support money to prop up your lifestyle." I walked to the door and held it open, my voice firm and unyielding. "Mom would be ashamed of how you've both acted. Now get out of my house!" Rachel grabbed her designer purse, muttering under her breath as she stormed out. My father lingered, looking lost and conflicted, but in the end he followed her without another word. That was 3 months ago. Since then, they haven't dared to bother me. Through the family grapevine, I've heard bits and pieces about how things have been going for them. Rachel, apparently, has been making my father's life a living hell, constantly whining about their reduced circumstances. She's furious that she can no longer spend her children's support payments on herself. My father, meanwhile, looks exhausted. Like he's aged a decade in just a few months, my cousin Sarah told me when I ran into her at the grocery store last week. Rachel's tantrums, she said, have even extended to complaining about having to shop at regular stores instead of her usual high-end boutiques. Do I feel bad? Honestly, no. My father made his choices. He chose to enable Rachel's behavior. He chose to stay silent while she abused my kindness. He chose to turn a blind eye to her neglect of her children. I do not regret standing up for what was right, even if it made me the villain in their eyes. Sometimes, doing the right thing means being the bad guy in someone else's story. And you know what? I sleep just fine at night, knowing those boys are safe and loved. As for my father's house, yes, I still own it. No, I haven't evicted him. Yet. But it's comforting to know I have that card to play if they ever decide to start up their nonsense again.